Freedom, rebellion, a black flag raised against the world. When you think of pirates, this is probably what comes to mind. We picture them as the ultimate symbols of a life without masters, a life of radical liberty on the high seas. They were outlaws, sure, but romantic outlaws, carving out their own destiny with a sword in one hand and a democratic pirate code in the other. They were the rebels who broke their chains. But what if I told you that the pirates' quest for freedom is inseparable from the brutal economy of slavery? That for many, the arrival of a pirate ship wasn't a sign of liberation, but a descent into an even worse fate. This is the hidden history of the complicated, contradictory, and dark connection between piracy and slavery. It's a story that reveals the pirates' world didn't just exist alongside the world of slavery, it existed because of it. To understand the pirate, you first have to understand the monstrous system they both fought against and fed upon. When we hear the golden age of piracy, it's hard not to think of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, buried chests overflowing with Spanish doubloons and pieces of eight, and swashbuckling heroes clashing on sandy beaches. But the reality of this era, which flared brightly and briefly, was far more complex and desperate than any treasure map could suggest. While historians debate the exact dates, the Golden Age is generally seen as running from the 1650s to the 1730s, with the most intense period of piracy happening between roughly 1690 and 1730. And to understand what really drove a person to become a pirate, you have to erase the idea that it was all about getting rich. For most men who went on the account, as they called it, piracy wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It was an escape. It was a rebellion born from the appalling conditions of life as an ordinary sailor. Imagine you're a young man in Bristol or Port Royal in the early 18th century. Your options are bleak. You could sign on to a merchant vessel where the captain is your absolute master, the discipline is brutal, and your meager pay is often stolen through legal trickery. The food would be rock-hard biscuits crawling with weevils and salted meat so old it's practically wood. Sicknesses like scurvy and dysentery were rampant, and if you got hurt on the job, you'd be tossed ashore at the next port with nothing. Or you could be pressed into service in the Royal Navy, which was basically a formal kidnapping. Press gangs roamed coastal towns, grabbing able-bodied men and forcing them onto warships where conditions were often even worse. This was the world that created pirates. As historian Marcus Rediker has documented, the pirate ship emerged as a radical, defiant answer to this brutal reality. It was a hierarchy, a form of government from below, at sea. When a man chose to become a pirate, he wasn't just choosing a life of crime, he was choosing a totally different kind of society. On a pirate ship, the tyrannical captain was replaced by a democratically elected one who could be voted out if he proved cruel or incompetent. The real power often lay with the elected quartermaster who managed day-to-day affairs and ensured a fair distribution of plunder and rations. Every man had a vote on major decisions. These rules were formalized in a document called the Articles, or the Pirate Code. These codes were astonishingly progressive. They guaranteed compensation for injuries, a set amount for losing an eye, a leg, or an arm. They guaranteed every man an equal share of food, water, and of course, loot. This floating democratic community was a direct rejection of the oppressive hierarchies that govern life on land and on legitimate ships. But this radical experiment wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was a tiny, floating world adrift on an ocean whose currents were dictated by a single, brutal economic engine, the transatlantic slave trade. The Caribbean Sea in the late 17th and early 18th centuries was the heart of a global economic revolution, and that revolution was powered by sugar. Sugar was the oil of its day, a luxury good turned staple that was generating immense profits for European empires. But this white gold was produced by a system of almost unimaginable brutality, massive plantations worked by enslaved Africans. This system was deliberately constructed. In 1672, King Charles II and London merchants founded the Royal Africa Company, a corporation with a royal monopoly designed to industrialize the trade of enslaved human beings to supply labor for colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. The profits were staggering. An enslaved person was treated as a piece of capital equipment, an investment that would yield a lifetime of forced labor. This system generated a torrent of wealth that flowed back to Europe, financing empires and creating a constant, bustling trade in the Caribbean. And it was this river of gold that pirates would learn to plunder. The engine for this was the infamous triangle trade. European ships sailed to West Africa with manufactured goods, traded them for captive Africans, and then began the horrific Middle Passage. The human beings packed into the holds of these ships faced unimaginable filth, disease, and despair. Those who survived were sold in the Americas. The ships then loaded up with sugar and tobacco to sail back to Europe, completing the triangle. Every leg of this journey was profitable, and every ship was a potential target. This is the world that historian Marcus Rediker starkly describes when he writes, "The growing riches of the few depended on the growing misery of many." The same brutal logic that maximized profit on land also applied at sea. Life aboard a slave ship, even for the crew, was a nightmare. The violence of the plantation system and the misery of life at sea created a vast, desperate population of people, runaway slaves, indentured servants, and brutalized sailors who saw little hope in the civilized world. It was from this pool of the dispossessed that pirates drew their numbers. They were the cast-offs of a ruthless new form of global capitalism. When a pirate lookout spotted the sails of a slaver, a Guinea man, as they were called, it was a moment of grim opportunity. Slave ships were some of the most attractive targets for pirates, but not for romantic reasons. There's no evidence pirates ever attacked a slave ship with the primary goal of liberating the people in the hold. Their motives were almost entirely pragmatic. So why were these ships prized targets? First, slavers were often built for speed to transport their human cargo before disease and death could cut into profits. This made them perfect vessels for pirates to commandeer. In fact, some of the most famous pirate ships, including Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge and Sam Bellamy's Whydah Galley, started their lives as slavers. Second, these ships carried more than just people. They were stocked with provisions, food, water, medicine, and alcohol that were vital for a pirate crew's survival. And of course, the human beings in the hold were themselves considered valuable cargo. What happened to the enslaved people on a captured vessel reveals the dark, contradictory nature of the pirate world. In many cases, if pirates had no easy way to sell the captives, they were simply abandoned, or in the most horrific instances, thrown overboard. When the pirate Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts captured the slave ship Porcupine, he tried to ransom the ship and its human cargo back to its captain. When the captain refused, Roberts ordered the ship to be set on fire, with 80 enslaved people still trapped aboard. Many pirates were former or even active slave traders. They understood the market and would attack a slaver, seize the human cargo, and sell the people they had just stolen for a quick profit. For an enslaved person in the hold, being captured by pirates often just meant a violent and uncertain change of masters. And yet, in a strange paradox, pirate attacks on the slave trade had an unintended consequence. By making the Middle Passage even more dangerous and costly, piracy actively disrupted the system. Every ship captured and every cargo lost ate into the profits of slave trading companies. For a time, their selfish, violent actions ironically helped to slow the explosive growth of slavery in the New World. Here is where the story gets really complicated. While many pirates were exploiters who participated in the slave trade, their ships also became one of the few places in the 18th century world where a black man could find a measure of freedom, equality, and power. Historians like Kenneth Kincor and Marcus Rediker estimate that during the Golden Age's peak, men of African descent may have comprised as much as a quarter to a third of all active pirates. How did this happen? Some were free black sailors who chose piracy to escape the brutal conditions on merchant ships. Others were fugitive slaves from plantations who saw a lawless life at sea as their only hope. But the most dramatic pathway was directly from the hold of a slave ship. When pirates captured a Guineaman, they could try to sell their human cargo, or they could do something more practical: ask the captives to join them. For a pirate captain needing manpower, a ship full of able-bodied men was a resource. For an enslaved African, the choice between perpetual slavery and a life of violent freedom was often an easy one. When Sam Bellamy's crew captured a slave ship, for example, historical sources suggest 25 of the enslaved men immediately joined his crew. Life for a black pirate wasn't a utopia, but on many ships, a shocking form of equality prevailed. Under the pirate articles, skin color often mattered less than a man's willingness to fight. A black pirate had the right to bear arms, to vote for his captain, and to receive a full, equal share of the plunder. This made the pirate ship arguably the most multiracial and egalitarian society in the Atlantic world. A man known only as Caesar, who served under Blackbeard, is one example of a black pirate who held a position of trust and authority. These motley crews, as terrified colonial authorities called them, were a profound threat to the established order. The sight of armed black men living and fighting as equals alongside white men on a pirate ship was the establishment's worst nightmare. For this reason, many contemporary writers deliberately hid or downplayed the existence of black pirates, fearing the news would inspire mass slave rebellions on land. The fact that pirate ships became these radical, multiracial communities is one of the most hidden parts of this story. If you're finding this history as fascinating as I do, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We get into the forgotten corners of history every week, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. All right, back to the high seas. The golden age of piracy was a short, violent affair. By the mid-1720s, the black flag was vanishing from the seas. This was no accident. It was the result of a concerted, brutal, and highly effective campaign by the very empires whose trade the pirates had been plundering. The disruption pirates caused to the slave trade was simply becoming too expensive for the powerful merchants and wealthy planters whose fortunes depended on it. For the slave economy to flourish, piracy had to be exterminated. The colonial powers launched a multi-pronged attack. First, they offered the king's pardon, a clean slate for any pirate who surrendered. This clever tactic fractured pirate crews and tempted many men to return to normal life. For those who refused, the state's response was merciless. A massive naval campaign hunted down pirate vessels. Captured pirates were subjected to swift, public trials and theatrical hangings, with their bodies often left to rot in gibbets at harbor entrances as a gruesome warning. Even in punishment, the racial hierarchies of the mainland reasserted themselves. While white pirates were almost always hanged, captured black pirates often faced a different fate, being sold or returned to slavery. It was a clear message from the authorities that a black person's life was considered property, even when they were a criminal. After the capture of Black Bart Roberts' crew, for example, the 77 African crew members were not tried for piracy, but were handed over to be sold back into bondage. The war on piracy was, in many ways, a war to make the Atlantic safe for the slave trade. Once the pirates were gone, the number of enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic skyrocketed. The temporary rupture in the Middle Passage had been repaired, and the engine of slavery was now running more efficiently than ever. While the pirates of the Caribbean were being hunted to extinction, another much older form of piracy, with slavery at its very core, was thriving on the other side of the Atlantic. For centuries, from roughly the 1500s to the early 1800s, the Barbary coast of North Africa, modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and Libya, was home to some of the world's most feared pirates, and their primary business was the slave trade. But their victims weren't Africans, they were Europeans. These Barbary corsairs conducted relentless raids across the Mediterranean, attacking ships and, most importantly, capturing their crews and passengers to be sold in the slave markets of North Africa. But they didn't just attack ships. In terrifying coastal raids, they would descend upon seaside villages in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, sometimes kidnapping the entire population. Their reach was astonishing, extending as far north as Britain, Ireland, and even Iceland. The 1631 sack of Baltimore in Ireland saw Barbary pirates carry off at least 107 villagers into slavery, an event that haunted the coast for generations. The scale of this trade was immense. Historian Robert Davis estimates that between the 16th and 19th centuries, Barbary pirates captured and enslaved somewhere between 1 and 1.25 million European Christians. The impact on Europe was profound. Entire stretches of the Italian and Spanish coastlines were abandoned out of fear. This story provides a crucial and unsettling mirror image to the transatlantic slave trade. For centuries, Europeans were not only the perpetrators of the slave trade, but also its victims. Captured Europeans faced a life of hard labor as galley slaves or were forced to work on state projects. The Barbary slave trade only came to an end in the early 19th century through overwhelming military force from the United States and European powers. These two parallel systems of piracy and slavery reveal a fundamental truth about this era. Freedom was a rare commodity, and the lines between predator and prey, slaver and enslaved, were far more blurred than we often imagine. The story of the pirate, when you strip away the romantic veneer, isn't a simple tale of rebellion. It's a history that's deeply and inextricably tangled with the rise of global capitalism, a system built on colonial exploitation and human slavery. Piracy didn't exist outside this system. It was a parasitic, paradoxical product of it. The pirate was a rebel, born from the brutality of life as a sailor in the slave economy. The pirate ship became a shocking space of democracy and racial equality, a haven where escaped slaves and brutalized sailors could live as equals. Yet this same pirate was often a predator who attacked slave ships not as a liberator, but as an opportunist. Many were themselves slave traders, perpetuating the very system others in their ranks had fled. They were, at once, a threat to the slave trade and a participant in it. Ultimately, the empires they challenged decided that protecting the immense profits of slavery was more important than tolerating the chaos of piracy. The state crushed the pirate rebellion to make the seas safe for the slave trade. The hidden connection between piracy and slavery reveals a world of deep moral complexity. It forces us to see that pirates weren't simple heroes or villains. They were desperate people, the dispossessed of a brutal new economic order, who created a fleeting, contradictory world of both radical freedom and profound cruelty. Their story is a stark reminder that history is rarely a clean narrative. It's a messy, tangled, and often tragic story of oppression, resistance, and the elusive nature of freedom in an ocean of injustice. What does it change about how we see pirates, knowing their story is so deeply tied to the history of slavery? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more hidden histories.